Had a slightly delayed chat, but now we're up and running officially. So we can all stop having a good time, and no one, no laughing. It's serious time now. We're done with the frivolity before the camera was rolling. Okay, so we have reached the end of Leviticus. We are at the end of Vayikra. We are in the very last two parshiot. It's another double header of the book of Leviticus, which is Behar and Bekhukotai. Everyone loves to say that one. And these two round out some of the more general legislations for the nation that they're going to need to know before they set off from Mount Sinai. Remember, the narrative seems to have completely stalled during this section of the Torah, but in fact it's been slowly working its way through in order to get us from the base of Mount Sinai to where we're going to be next week, which is on the march. So we are moving in time, even though the discussion hasn't focused on that narrative. Everyone clear on the concept? Okay, so we are left at the end of Vayikra with a very strong exhortation. One of those good English words we don't get to use a lot. It's God trying to lay things out very, very clearly for us, very, very starkly. Do good, get good. Do bad, get bad. And sometimes it seems so stark that it almost seems obvious. And sometimes when things seem obvious, we don't notice the details. We've sort of heard this pattern before, yes? That's where you all say yes. And let's go ahead and take a look and see if we can find which detail Rabbi Neely is going to play with today. So, we're going to start off with actually the beginning of Bekhukotai, which is on page 747 if you're in the Eitz Chaim. It's in chapter 26, verse 3 of the book of Leviticus if you're using your own version. All right. Who'd like to lay down the law?
Thanks. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant your rains in their season, so that the earth shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, and your vintage shall overtake the sowing, and you shall eat your fill of bread and dwell securely in your land. All right, so pause very quickly, just make sure we understand some of the imagery here. Rain is rather important if you are an agrarian people. It is doubly important if you are an agrarian nation living in the land of Israel, where the vast majority of the water that's used for watering your crops only comes by the rain. You don't have the Nile like they did in Egypt. You don't have the Tigris and Euphrates. You don't have the Indus and all the other great river civilizations. You've got the Jordan, which is all right, but it's not exactly the world's greatest irrigation source. You've got a few springs here and there. Most of the water for ancient agriculture came from the rain. So when God's talking about the rain, it's just a symbol for this general flowing beneficence at the root, pun intended, root growing, the root of every blessing that follows afterwards. Make sense? Good. And this notion of the threshing overtaking the vintage and the vintage overtaking the sowing, if you're not used to working on a farm and working with different crops, the notion is the threshing, which is where you are thrashing out the grain that you've harvested to get the good little kernels. That will go on a long time. And why would it be taking a long time? Because you got a lot of it. Exactly. If you only got 3 little bits of grain, your threshing only takes 3 minutes. If you've got mounds and mounds of grain because it was a good year, then your threshing is going to take a long time. In fact, it's going to take so long that you'll still be threshing when you would normally have already started doing the vintage. You would have already started working with the grapes. And in fact, you'll be doing the grapes so long that you'll still be stuck doing that when it's normally time for doing the sowing. Now, this doesn't mean your work never ends. This means the bounty is so great, you never get to the end of it. It'd be like saying, you're going to have so much money you wouldn't even be able to count it. Because by the time you can't count it as fast as you make it. That basically is sort of what's being said here. That may be a little bit more of a we can relate to that image a bit more easily than threshing, sowing, and
Binti? And making wine? Good. All right. Blessings all around. Keep going.
I will grant peace in the land, and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts, and no sword shall cross your land. You shall give chase to your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. 5 of you shall give chase to 100, and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Your enemies shall fall before you by the sword.
All right, got that? So we've had the blessings of prosperity. Now we're having the blessing of peace. And the peace will be so great that there will be no sword throughout the land. And if there were even the need for conflict, don't worry, everyone's going to run away from you. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Happy times. Keep going.
I will look with favor upon you and make you fertile and multiply you, and I will maintain my covenant with you.
Meaning God will keep his end of the bargain.
You shall eat old grain long stored, and you shall have to clear out the old to make room for the new.
That means there's going to be more than we even have the storerooms to store it in.
I will establish my abode in your midst, and I will not spurn you. I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out from the land of the Egyptians to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk correct.
Okay. What's that?
Freedom.
Freedom. Freedom. Seems to be the main theme of this last paragraph, right? Freedom. So we're going to come back to this because there's something in the Hebrew that's just a little bit unsmooth. And remember, things that are unsmooth don't mean we should just gloss over them. Things that are unsmooth, we want to pick up and examine. Right? It's that bit of grain that causes the oyster to make a pearl, the irritant that causes the building up of layers. Well, it's the same with study. If it just seems too easy, then you're not noticing things. And when you notice something that seems kind of awkward, well, that's what we're going to look at. So there's a phrase here at the very end of that paragraph where it says ve'olech. Are you all with me? We're at the last line of the next to last line, the last word of that line that begins with ve'olech. Everyone find where I'm looking at? Okay. Ve'olech etchem komiyut. All right. Any part of that word phrase sound familiar?
And that's in the Birkat Hamazon.
Komiyut is in the Birkat Hamazon, absolutely. And what does it mean? Not exactly. And it's actually someplace else that if you pay attention during the morning services, is extremely common as well. It's at the end of Ahava Rabbah. This is actually a phrase that crops up from time to time, and it's important to remember that the words of our blessings, like Birkat Hamazon or Ahava Rabbah, were not chosen by random by the sages. They were not simply invented by the sages. I mean, Hebrew is a very flexible language, but they tried to use phrasing that would echo the words of the Torah. So there are many quotes or paraphrases throughout our blessings that come from the Torah, and this is one of them. So if you notice on the Ahava Rabbah section on the handout, right, it says at the very beginning, V'havienu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz. This is the part of the service, by the way, and if you picked up Debbie Meiten's very nice handout at the mitzvah fair, you would have seen this. If you didn't get the handouts, by the way, we are going to try and put them online soon so that people will be able to download them. But this is the part of Ahava Rabbah where we take the tzitzit, the 4 corners of our talitot, and we wrap them together, because what does it actually mean? And bring us in peace from the 4 corners of the earth. So just as we want God to gather us in the 4 corners, we physically gather the 4 corners of our talitot. Symbolizing, of course, as well, that our gathering is connected to our observance of the mitzvot, which is symbolized by the tzitzit. So, gather us together from the 4 corners of the earth, v'tolichenu homimut liratsenu, and lead us upright. This is the word in italics, to our land. So that word generally gets translated as upright or erect, as it is used here in this verse. Sound good? Yes? Okay. All too easy, right? But why would we be asking for God to lead us upright to our land? Why would God be promising to help us walk upright? I mean, what kind of promise is that? I mean, am I better off like this than I am like this? I mean, is this God's way of saying don't slouch, or I'm going to get you a back brace? Or, I mean, what in the world would God be trying to indicate by this language, and why would we echo it throughout so many of our prayers?
It connotes pride in your achievement, in being part of God's nation.
So the posture itself has an emotional content to it, of pride, of celebration, of joy, of being happy with our achievement, of being part of God's nation. So there would be a difference if we said, help us to slink back to our homeland. That would perhaps have a different emotional content. yeah. So maybe erect is purely this emotional uprightness in terms of being free, of being strong, of being proud.
Well, I'm thinking of pictures I've seen of them being led by the Chaldeans after the destruction, and they've got hooks in their bent.
Mm-hmm.
So they were prisoners, so to speak. So to me, it connotes I'm free of all that. I'm on my own.
So being hunched is the posture of being subjugated, subjugation, and being upright is the posture of freedom, which would seem to work quite well with the language that we just read in the paragraph, or I should say that Marion read, right? That God says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be their slaves no more, who broke off the bars of your yoke and made you walk up erect." So it would seem by context to really be emphasizing this notion that the upright posture is one that symbolizes freedom and independence, as opposed to being slumped, indicating subjugation. Which of course gets reinforced by the midrash from the Sifra, the teaching from Sifra that Rashi also brings for this section, which is, what is the erect in stature having to do with? Because it's due to our relief from bondage. You get rid of our chains, and I like the way Nikki was saying, if you have like the heavy metal collar around your neck, you take this off, the yoke of slavery, you're able to stand up. It's just a natural reaction. You're walking into the car with your groceries, you all experience this, and you're bent over carrying the groceries, you put them down, and you naturally stand up. And that's what the Sifra and Rashi by extension seems to be saying is the purpose of this verse. However, we had another question or comment.
Just another interpretation. Upright could mean also righteous, steeped in God's commandments, that sort of thing.
It could indeed, although there are other words that tend to get used more for being upright in that sense, like yashar, to be straight, and of course sadiq. But yes, that absolutely, that if you are blameless, that is to say, if you've been living the proper life, you have nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to hide, and so you would stand proud in your own accomplishments, not just of the general accomplishments of the nation. Very good. All right. So no one reading this is thinking of 150-foot tall hermaphrodites? No?
I don't usually.
No, not usually?
Yes.
Okay. Ready to have some fun? Okay. I promise we'll get to a serious implication to this at the end. But sometimes the ways of Midrash can be twisty-turny things, as we're going to see. So you just have to go along with the ride and see as we take it apart, and how this verse gets reassembled to a vision of the Messianic age where we will all be 150-foot tall hermaphrodites. Okay?
Okay.
What's that? What's a hermaphrodite? A hermaphrodite is a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. Okay, I'm not asking you to picture this at the moment. I mean, I know you've all heard the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, from that 1950s movie. So this is a slightly different version of that.
I actually saw it.
What's that? I've seen the poster. It became part of, the kitsch culture. I saw the poster, only the poster. Okay. Who'd like to help us underway? Mary, do you want to keep reading for us?
Sure.
Why don't you pick up, it's the third paragraph on the handout that begins, said Rabbi Elazar.
The first Adam was from earth to the heaven. Since the day that God created man upon the earth, Deuteronomy 4:32.
All right, so let's make sure we understand, because he's a little brief here. Rabbi Elazar says the first man, meaning Adam Harishon, that is the man in the Garden of Eden, he was from earth to the heavens, which means that's how tall he was. He was so tall. How tall was he? He was so tall that when he stood up, his head touched the heavens. Now, you have to sort of do a little visualization here of the ancient conception of the heavens. Because when we think of the heavens, we think of just air, right? And we think of outside of air is outer space and solar systems and all of that. They imagined that there was a dome over the earth. So this is the earth, and this is heaven. And so Adam was like this. Got it?
Yes.
So when he stood up, his head touched the top, his feet touched the bottom. He stretched from top to bottom. All right? Okay, and keep going.
But when he went sour,
Meaning when he broke the commandment of not eating the fruit.
the Holy One, blessed be he, put his hand on him and cut him down to size. You have fashioned me after and before and laid your hand upon him.
All right, so the proof text for this is from the book of Psalms, which is, you have fashioned me before and after and put your hand on me. And he's saying what's happening here is, you made me one way, and then you put your hand on me, and maybe another way. We're working with that?
Yeah.
Okay. There is another opinion, by the way, that says, actually it is more like this. That when he laid down, his head was from one end to the other. But neither is important for us to argue about at the moment, but this is the biggest version, is that Adam was from heaven to earth. And we're gonna cut him down to size, don't worry, this is not the only opinion. But I want to show you that we could start with the notion of being however far it is from earth to the dome of heaven. But we're gonna actually scale it down. How are we doing so far? Keep going.
And your gates of carbuncles.
This is a very famous line from Isaiah. We read this during the summer when we're reading the Haftarot of comfort, of consolation after Tisha B'Av. And one of the statements is that when Jerusalem is being rebuilt, the gates are going to be, and the walls will be made of carbuncles, which no one seems to know what that means in English. What's that? No. Well, everyone thinks of carbuncles. The only thing that people think of for carbuncles nowadays are the things you go to your podiatrist to have removed.
Right.
That's not the only meaning of the word carbuncle in English. Were you going to volunteer another meaning of carbuncle? Anyone?
Yes, when it attaches itself to the outside of the ship.
That's a barnacle. That's a barnacle. We can play this game a long time because carbuncle is not a common word. It's a
Gemstone.
it's a red gemstone. It's a precious stone. Okay, so it's a precious stone. So when God says He's going to rebuild our gates of carbuncles, He's not saying I'm going to rebuild it of foot sores. He's saying I'm going to rebuild it out of gemstones. All right, rather than just using any old limestone that happens to be lying around, it's going to be made out of precious stones. Okay, so now we got that generally down. We have a question.
Said Rabbi Yohanan, the Holy One, blessed be he, is destined to bring jewels and pearls that are 30 cubits by 30, and will cut out openings from them 10 cubits by 20, setting them up at the gates of Jerusalem. A certain
Hold on, pause there, right?
Okay.
And then we're going to cut out gates. Now, why does he feel the need to tell us how big the carbuncles are? Well, I think he's trying to explain to us that when it says that I'm going to make your walls of carbuncles, God wasn't saying I'm going to make it with 559 trillion tiny little gemstones. But in fact, what I meant was I'm going to find supersized carbuncles that will be used for your gates, right? We're not going to go with the trillions of little stones. We're going to go with the giant 30 cubit square stones. 30, remember, cubits are about 1.5 feet, so we're talking 45-foot square or so. So massive, massive gemstones with a nice, neat hole cut through them as a gate. Sound good? Okay, keep going.
A certain disciple ridiculed him. Well, jewels even the size of the egg of a dove are not available. So will jewels of such dimensions be found?
Right, so come on. Who's buying this? Says the student. You're saying that they're going to be 45-foot square cubes of gemstone in the days of the Messiah. 45 foot. Since nobody has even seen a carbuncle bigger than, the size of a dove egg, which is, about like that big, what are you talking about? That is ridiculous, and so he ridiculed the teaching.
After a while, the ship went out to sea. He saw ministering angels engaged in cutting up jewels and pearls, 30 cubits by 30, on which were engravings 10 by 20.
All right, pause real quick. Just again, point out one of the details. Not only does he have this mystical experience of seeing them cut up these things, the fact that they are cutting them down to size would imply that they were even bigger originally. Okay, so they're taking the giant gemstones and making them small sized for use. Keep going.
He said to him, "For whom are these?" They said to him, "The Holy One, blessed be thee, is destined to set them up at the gates of Jerusalem." The man came before Rabbi Yohanan. "It is truly fitting for you to give an exposition, for just as you said, so I myself have seen."
So he's like, keep preaching the truth, man, because I saw it. Which you would normally think was a compliment.
He said to him, "Empty-headed idiot, if you had not seen, you would not have believed. So you ridicule the teachings of sages." He set his eyes on him, and the student turned into a heap of bones.
All right, now, everybody turns the page. You think we're really going to turn the page without talking about that?
I had a teacher like that.
You had a teacher who could look at you and turn you to dust. And I think most of us have experienced people like that, either for good or bad, that had the capacity to wither you with a glance. And that seems to be what's happening here. But let's set aside the withering gaze and talk about the criticism. Was the student really that wrong? I mean, was it wrong for him to be, well, not just to question, but to doubt something that was completely incomprehensible? And was it wrong for him to have believed after having seen it that somehow that was a mistake, that he needed proof, and that having seen the proof, he didn't deny the proof, he accepted it, but somehow he gets in trouble for that? For accepting proof?
I don't think that's wrong.
Doesn't sound wrong to me. Doesn't sound wrong to me. What I think is going on with Rabbi Yochanan's criticism of the student is not so much that he doubted the impossible because he didn't have proof, but that he ridiculed the teaching. Okay, it's right, because as he says, you ridicule the teachings of sages. It's one thing to say, the sages described Adam as being foot on the ground, head in the clouds. That's a load of nonsense. That's one way to respond to that teaching. Another way is to say, well, everything we know about anatomy and physics says that doesn't really work. So what could the sages have been trying to teach us if it wasn't about anatomy and physics? Or maybe it was, but because I can't experience that, I'm going to look for an additional teaching from this other than simply how I would paint a picture of Adam. And by doing so, I can still embrace the teachings of the sages, I can still get wisdom from the teachings of the sages, and I can leave my doubt just over in the corner there. And if I have a mystical experience where I see giant gemstones being carved into the right shape, then I can understand. Actually, they did mean it literally, and that can join with all of the meaning and truth I've already gotten from them metaphorically. And if it happens that I never have that mystical experience, and perhaps those sages did their words to be taken metaphorically, then I won't. But I wouldn't ridicule simply because I don't understand in the meantime. You see the distinction there? Maybe? It's tricky. And it's even trickier in our own days because there has become a fetish of the ridiculous. We want to embrace the ridiculous to show our devotion, as though somehow, you used to show your piety by praying loud, or you used to show your piety by donating to tzedakah in great amounts. Now you show your piety by proclaiming proudly that you believe the ridiculous, because that way everybody knows you must be one of the faithful, because only someone who was faithful would have ever said such nonsense. And that attitude, I think, is a little backwards. It's one thing to say, I don't know. Maybe the sages meant this literally, maybe they didn't. Literally doesn't seem to work with the world as I know it, but metaphorically, that seems to fit the world pretty well as I know it. And so I'm going to work with that, and I will hold my judgment on the impossibility until I know more. But that doesn't mean I turn my back on their teachings. It doesn't mean I ridicule those who believe them, but I do try to find meaning in the meantime. Sound good? Okay, so hold that in mind as we continue with our discussion of the 150 tall hermaphrodite. Okay, Mary, what's yours? Just for simplicity's sake.
An objection was raised, and I will leave you upright.
That's our verse. Remember our verse when we started?
Rabbi Meir says, that means 200 cubits, twice the height of the first man. Rabbi Judah says, 100 cubits, the height of the temple and its walls. We, whose sons are as plants grown up in their youth, whose daughters are as corner pillars, carved after the fashion of the temple.
Okay, that's taken from the Psalms, but this whole section that we've been reading from is from Bava Batra. Now you might have thought, when they raised an objection, the objection would be, what are they talking about 45 tall gemstones? Or what are you talking about 20-foot cubit gates? But that's not the objection. The objection is, that gate's not big enough. The objection is a 20 cubit tall gate isn't big enough, because we're going to be upright like Adam Rishon. And upright means komiyut, we will be double measure. It's coming from the word koma, which means to measure or stature, and it will be pluraled, meaning doubled. So if we're like the stature of the first man, which here they have by midrashic interpretation as being 100 cubits, then we'll be at least 100 cubits, or perhaps 200 cubits if we're doubling it. And in which case, you're going to need a bigger gate. All right, you see that little dodge there? They take the word komiyut and they say it's really like a double measure, or perhaps a koma miyut. Blending miyut is sort of being a phrase of me'ah, meaning the word 100, or me'ot, meaning 200. A 200 koma, 200 stature. That must be what they're talking about. So when God leads us, we're going to be giants, and if we're going to be giants, you need a bigger gate. That's the objection. How we doing? Okay?
Yeah.
But okay, so we got down now why we have a teaching of 100 to 200 cubit tall people at the time of the redemption. We understand where they're coming from that? Yeah, I'm not asking you to run out and start buying bigger shoes. I'm asking whether or not you understand how they midrashically moved to that position. If you don't know that, then the next part's going to get even more confusing. Okay? Okay, good. Hearing no objections, so moved. Now, at the end of that midrashic discussion, they explain that it is being taken from the height of the temple and its walls. And with this verse from the Psalms, they talk about the sons who are plants grown up, and the daughters who are as corner pillars, carved after the fashion of the temple, after the Heichal. And we know how big that was. That was 100 cubits. But this juxtaposition of the boys and the girls stirs our midrashic memory of something else that has to do with the boys and the girls. All the way back when we're talking about Adam Rishon, back about the first man. Does someone else want to pick up on the hermaphroditic mysticism we're about ready to hit?
Well,
Mike?
there was a midrash that Adam Harishon was both sexes.
There's a midrash that Adam Harishon, the first man, was both sexes, both genders. Let's find out why. Why don't you take over the reading for a little bit? For with two faces.
For with two faces were they created, and now there is but one stature. For the male is forbidden from being constantly by the female, lest they come to the prohibition of becoming accustomed to sin. But in the future, for then the evil inclination will be removed from the land, then in truth there will be two statures. And this is the explanation of the Oleh et Ken
Komiyut. Okay, so he's picking up on this plural of komiyut, which is the plural form of the word stature, or height in this sense, or measure. And he's saying, well, you know, we did used to have double stature when we were combined beings. When we were first made, and we're going to look at the proof text of this in a second, but work with me for the moment. When we were first made, God made us as two beings joined, man and woman as one entity. And if you think about it, if I'm here and she's attached here, then we have double height. It's not double straight up, but there's my height and her height. But, as he points out here, in the current day, if we were to go around like this all the time, we would grow too accustomed to the intimacy that comes between men and women, and our Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, would lead us to do all sorts of things we're not supposed to. So for the moment, we're two separate entities, so that we don't get too familiar. Got it? So at the moment, we're only one koma, we're only one measure, each individually. But in the world to come, when the days of the Mashiach, when the Yetzer Hara is gone, when the evil inclination has been banished, we can return to our original form, which is together, man and woman. And we won't have to be worried about any excessive hanky-panky, because the evil inclination won't be around to tempt us anymore. Following this? And then we will be komiyut. We will be the plural statures. We will be double stature again. How we doing?
What's going to make the evil inclination go away?
Good question, and one that could be answered a couple different ways, but let's use, for the sake of argument, the idea that when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes, and turns the hearts of the world to God, because we recognize God's teachings as true and correct in all ways, then there will be no room for the evil inclination to get a foothold. I mean, if you know the good reliably, and you are committed to the good consistently, then transgressing has no attraction, because you recognize that goodness is entirely fulfilled, and joy will come entirely through not transgressing. And once that happens, you know, it's like when you walk around the street and you see somebody drop a penny, you don't think, ooh, I'm going to steal that, because why would I steal a penny? That's worthless to me. Eventually, transgression will seem the same way. We will be so clear-minded when it comes to understanding God that transgression will seem like a worthless opportunity, and one that I would never bother myself with. That's one explanation.
May I take Sally's question a little bit further? Does that mean that's the end of free will in the world in the days of Mashiach?
Does it mean it's the end of free will? Is a massive question. I think the short answer is no. But the short answer would be, I wouldn't call it the end of free will, but it would be the end of people using their free will badly. Now, if the outcome is 100% predictable, does that mean whether you've lost free will or not? Is an argument for philosophers or a discussion another day. But it doesn't mean that we're going to be pulled like puppets by invisible strings of force from God. It means we will direct ourselves together. Let me give an example. When birds are flying in flocks, like if you've ever seen those wonderful videos of starlings flying those huge clouds of birds, and they are swooping and turning in perfect unison with one another, do they have free will? I mean, I would say they still could choose to fly against the flock, but they know that life is a lot better for them when they fly with the flock. Makes it a lot harder for the eagles to pick out any one of them. Is one of the advantages behaviorally for them. But I would say they still could choose. There's nothing magnetic about the other birds. They're not locked wing to wing. They could simply say, you know what, I want to go left. I don't care that everyone's going right. But they know that their lives are best served by following the direction. And if we were to act similarly towards Torah and God, you would see humans moving in perfect harmony with each other and with Torah. And I would still argue we had free will, even though our behavior would look orchestrated.
Let me ask a grammar question on coming removed.
Yep.
Is that a plural of a?
Well, yeah, that's the problem. It's kind of a weird word.
I know, I can't.
And that's why it's the nugget for being rolled over and over again to see what it's trying to say to us. Because it kind of seems adjectival, verbial-ish, but it can also sort of be read in this pluralistic way of koma, and so you end up with this opportunity from an awkward word to say, well, awkwardness means that there is something there. And so by pluralizing it, as we've just seen from Jonathan Elischutz, there's this new image of we used to be one and therefore doubled. Now we are single, we will be double again.
Does this appear in any other form anywhere else?
Not exactly. I mean, the word koma, the root word does appear.
Oh, come on. Oh,
Right.
Oh, right.
Appears quite a lot.
Oh, okay.
But it's this phrase that gets echoed throughout our liturgy,
Yeah. Okay.
precisely because of the messianic connotations of what we started off with being upright, and of course something this common and yet this unusual in its grammatical form is going to be worked over by the sages to try and get all of the meaning out of it that we can. Okay, so now we're up to the notion that we will be rejoined with our counter-gender being, so to speak, that we will become this, again, the Greek hermaphrodite is perhaps a bit more fun to say than it is what's actually being mentioned here. We will be reunited with the original form of man, which is man and woman as one entity. Okay, and just let's drive home that midrash about the unity.
God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Genesis.
And keep going.
The man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh.
All right, so two of the verses that are very famous from the beginning of Genesis is talking about God created man in his image, male and female he created them. That awkward grammatical shift from God made him to God made them is the root of this notion of, well, the them was the male-female double aspect of the first human. And that is what God is talking about in this generation, this section. And then the notion that woman was taken from man, and yet they will seek to reunite as husband and wife, as being just the natural order of things, because that's how they were originally made in the Garden of Eden, is followed up there in chapter 2. Following so far? Mm-hmm. And then the Zohar makes it explicit.
And though it was settled, we must look into this verse. So God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him. Since it already said his image, why repeat again? In the image of God he created him. He answers, There were two levels in the man, since he was composed of male and female. Therefore, there is one for the male and one for the female.
That is to say, there was one created him, to refer to the creation of the male aspect of humanity, and one created him to refer to the female aspect of humanity, which was united in the beginning.
And as a result of this, there were assuredly two faces, and at the end of the verse proves it, since it is written male and female, he created them.
Right? So that awkward plural at the end of the verse is reminding us that this wasn't just a layering of essences, that this was man face, woman face.
Although the female was attached to his side, she on her own was also composed of two sides, which are chesed and judgment, to be complete in all.
And we're going to leave that for another discussion. So the Zohar begins to go into the nature of the essence of the male and female aspects and the different, he wrote the different ways of accessing God. And we're not going to play with that right now because that's a different level of fire to be touching. But the basic notion here, I hope that you understand, is that there is a very strong tradition that this original human being created in the first book of Genesis was a double creature. That was a creature of both male and female. And that we were diminished by being separated, and that our ultimate redemption will be to be reunited in that double fashion. How we doing?
That's pretty heavy stuff.
Pretty heavy stuff. And come on, 150-foot tall hermaphrodites? No one's going to ridicule this? And very confusing. So, I mean, we can see that poor student, who was giving the rabbi a hard time on the previous page about the size of the stones. I mean, come on. What do we do? Is this when we say in our blessings that we hope that God's redemption will come speedily in our days? Are we imagining becoming a 150-foot tall hermaphrodite? Is that what we are praying for? Is that our vision of the messianic redemption? Is that the vision these rabbis had of the messianic redemption? You can't speak for them. That's hard, yeah. But
I don't think that in conservative movement that we're
put aside making you a spokesperson for the conservative movement. What about you?
I can't visualize that.
It doesn't speak to you as a yearning for this stage of human existence.
No.
No, that's not the idea of prosperity that we got in the beginning of the Torah portion, the idea of peace and fulfillment of the covenant, that resonates. And the 150-foot tall giant, male-female combined entity,
No.
not stirring your passion during prayer.
No.
Okay?
This makes the point where one sometimes questions the sage's interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So, because the sage is only a human being, even if he wasn't God.
Well, correct. The sage is only a human being. The sage is not God. However, we do rely upon the sage's teachings to know how to serve God. So when you lift your cup on Friday night to say the Kiddush, those words are not in the Torah per se. We are fulfilling the remembrance of Shabbat, which is mentioned as an explicit commandment, as we believe God wants us to do, based upon the words of the sages that instructed us that this was what the words of keeping Shabbat meant, or remembering Shabbat actually in that case. So they may not be God, and they certainly don't speak with the infallibility of a prophet of God, but we do rely heavily upon their words, and we do take their words as being the bedrock by which we use Torah in the world, as opposed to just reading the Torah like a novel. So they are a little bit more than just human in terms of their position in our faith. Even though any individual one of them we know is human through and through and flesh and blood in every way. But their words do have much more impact than the words of the rest of us.
And the problem I had was when Rashi says one thing, his grandson says the opposite. They're both sages, so you do get these conflicts where they're kind of
which we already saw about the gate. You know, we had one guy said the gate's going to be 20, and the other guy said it can't be only 20, we need at least 200. So there seems to be some difficulty when they contradict one another. I will point out that generally speaking, contradictions when it comes to the agadic teachings, that is to say their teachings on philosophy, on the visions of the future or the mystical world, they generally can dispute each other on those with impunity. When it comes to the law, that's where they seek unanimity. So there is a little bit more wiggle room when we're talking about how big your gate can be for the end of days than there is about how big your cup needs to be for Kiddush. That they sit down and actually figure out. Whereas this, oftentimes these discussions are left open for multiple voices from our tradition. But let's see if we can't get an understanding of this voice that's other than just they really thought there was going to be a 200-foot tall hermaphrodite. That they really thought Adam was as tall as the heaven. That they really think that our redemption is going to make us be a giant. That somehow when Mashiach shows up, we're all going to magically start growing, like the attack of the 50-foot woman thing. Let's see what else we can do. And we're going to start off with that with one of the most famous verses dealing with the issue of when the Mashiach comes, and one which I commend all of you to remember, because it's a very important touchstone for understanding. It's not too long. Read the last verse on the page.
There is no difference between this world and the days of Mashiach, except for the servitude of the nations alone. From Shabbat.
From Shabbat 115b in the Talmud, and as actually codified by Rambam, yes, I figured that, in his Mishnah Torah. When Rambam's talking about what do we actually believe is going to happen when the Mashiach shows up, he doesn't talk about giant gemstone gates. He brings this quote from Shabbat. Now, there are other people who disagree. I mean, we got lots of opinions, as you already said. But this one has become a fairly powerful cornerstone for much of Judaism for most of the last 2,000 years. But what does it mean? There's no difference between this world and the world of Mashiach except for the servitude of the nations. It's referring to our servitude to the nations. Meaning, you'll know the days of the Mashiach are here when we are no longer subjugated to other nations. But if you're expecting the sky to turn pink, if you're expecting the cats and dogs to lie down together and get married and raise puppy kittens, no. The laws of nature are not going to fly out the window when Mashiach shows up. Oppression, subjugation, suffering, yes, gone. But the world itself will essentially keep spinning the way it did before he showed up. It's what we do on the world that will be fundamentally different. Okay, so if we hold that as a North Star, as the way we line up our compass when reading some of these other statements, how might we interpret the notion of being 150 foot tall at the time of the redemption? Anyone want to take a what?
Not literally.
No, not literally, but what could that mean metaphorically then? What might they be trying to tell people?
Grow in stature of righteousness.
You'll grow in stature, you'll grow in righteousness. You will be powerful, you will not be weak, you will be strong. You could also say that because they are trying to connect it to Adam HaRishon, that you will be as we were intended to be in the first creation, when we were first placed on this earth. That you will be as perfect as he was before he screwed up. And that you will have that same stature. And that there will be nothing clinging to you, so to speak, to make you feel small in the eyes of God. Make sense?
What about them?
Well, hold on a second. One question first, or comment, and then we'll come to the second question, which I pretty much, I guess where you're going.
Well, Isaiah 2 talks about in the last days, all the nations will flow up to
Mhm.
Mount Zion for destruction, for everything.
Right.
So it's like you're like in the mythical God.
In the eyes of the world, the stature of Israel, the stature of the Jews will also grow as the people realize we've been sort of telling them this for a while, they kind of ignored, but we won't say, I told you so. We'll say welcome, I hope. And that could also mean what being 100 foot tall would mean, or to have your gates be made out of gemstones would represent the respect the world would give Jerusalem and would give Torah at that time.
And that man and woman would be equal?
And the man and woman would be equal.
It's okay.
I actually believe that, yes, there was some element to that. That I believe that they understood that the division between man and woman in their society and the inequality in stature between men and women in their society was not what God intended. There are numerous midrashim and teachings throughout the ages that talk about how men and women were created as one, and that woman was taken from the middle of man to be his equal, not from his foot, not from his head, and that was the ideal circumstance. And the fact that we live in a sub-ideal society doesn't mean we shouldn't yearn for the proper joining shoulder to shoulder of man and woman as being of equal stature to stand at redemption, and that both parts are necessary, both spiritually, psychologically within us, as well as in our society, that both men and women are necessary, and you can't have a truly redeemed society without equal participation of both. Now, there may be some that argue that we're not there yet, so don't rush the whole equality thing. I disagree. I think if we can achieve the equality, even if Mashiach hasn't shown up yet, why wouldn't we? The same way that we can achieve an end to many forms of human suffering through tzedakah, through medicine, and through good social programming, we should, rather than wait for Mashiach to show up and make it a done deal, we should do as much as we can in the meantime. If we can make man and woman stand equally together, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we? For Mashiach to come, don't we have to work to make it a better world? Maybe. There's actually a very long argument in Sanhedrin about this, because on the one hand, you don't want to tell people no, because then they'll stop working, they'll stop trying. On the other hand, saying yes has its own dangers as well, because if you say that it's through our righteousness that Mashiach will come, and only come, then there are three ways to look at it. One, well, we've been trying to be righteous for 1,000 years now, and he still ain't here, so I guess that promise is false. Or, well, okay, maybe he'll come tomorrow when we get better. Maybe it'll take a little bit longer, which is hard for most people to live with. The notion that we haven't been righteous enough, but we could be righteous enough tomorrow. And then the third is, have you looked at the world today? You really think we're going to get our act together before Mashiach shows up? If it's contingent on us, it'll never happen. It'd be like saying, strand 1,000 people on a desert island and give them all the tools and all the computers they need and tell them to build an airplane to get off. Do you really think 1,000 people will work together to build an airplane to get off the island, or do you think they'll use their tools to build catapults to take the other person's coconut? So it's very hard for many people to have enough faith in humanity to stake their faith in Mashiach on us. And so the answer that's generally given is, if we merit it, Mashiach can come before the appointed time. And if we don't, God has a backup plan. And Mashiach will show up at least by the appointed hour. So we can bring it forward, but even if we don't, even if we fail, God is not going to leave us to our own problems. God will eventually say, all right, game over, I'm coming in. Not that God is the Mashiach, but God will send the Mashiach to make sure that things go right. So the ref blowing the whistle finally and saying, okay, all right.
Isn't it also the case that if we do the footwork, that the transition would be easier?
Absolutely. There are many teachings that say that the coming of Mashiach is often foretold as being a very difficult time as the world comes to A, grips with its own troubles, and B, is divided until it is abundantly clear that this is the way to go. And that if we were able to move us closer to the way to go prior to that arrival, then all of those troubles will be greatly reduced. So there are many good reasons to do it, but it's important to keep that balance of hope that God will pull us out of the fire no matter what, and also feeling our own compulsion to be doing what we should to make it a smoother and quicker process.
Does this only apply to the Jewish people?
No.
Yeah.
The ultimate redemption is for the whole world.
So,
And what?
so the Messiah can't come until everybody, not just the Jewish people, but the whole, all of the people.
No, the Messiah will come eventually no matter what we and the rest of the world do. But if we and the rest of the world do what God has asked us to do, which is not that hard, it's just hard to get everyone working at the same time, then it could happen much, much sooner. That's what we hope. And you know what? I say that's worth a try. Now, we've tried the opposite for a while, and it hasn't been working out so well.
Isn't there another midrash that says that everybody kept 3 Shabbatot?
As an example of the combination of our efforts and the possibility that it can create, it's if everybody kept one Shabbat all at once, or whether they kept them consecutively, depending upon who your teacher was, that then Mashiach would come, is simply trying to drive home. It's just that easy, because I know Shabbat seems hard sometimes and it seems complicated, but really it's not. Just don't do stuff you shouldn't and do the few things you should, and most of the day is there for you to have fun and rest with your family anyway. So what are you complaining about? For the vast majority of us, and if it's not that easy for other people, we should be helping make it easier for them. So the people that have to work 12 days a week because they can't make ends meet, we should be trying to help them so that they can have a Shabbat. That are suffering from diseases that we could have cured centuries ago if we'd only been focusing more on medicine than other things, we should continue to try and make sure they can have a Shabbat. So there are some definite notions of that. If it's just that easy and it's in our hands, Shabbat is an example. Do I believe it is the ultimate trigger of the Mashiach? I think it's meant to say as an example, as representative of the potential. And a specifically chosen representative of the potential, because Shabbat is a taste of what that will be like. Okay. I guess we can throw an early Shabbat Shalom, even though it's only Wednesday.